Azania, South Africa. Some of you may have heard that term before, some may not have. Azania is the Africanist line, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a minute, claims that the original name for that part of the world is called Azania. So you'll hear some organizations and others use the name Azania. ANC has never generally used that term, Azania. So that will be relevant as we go through. You'll see the relevance. So we, the Africanists like myself and people like myself, people like the AFPRP and other Pan-Africanist organizations, we recognize it as Azania and South Africa just as the colonial name. So African leadership, we're going to investigate the historical models of nation building in Africa. So let's go. This is what we're going to cover every week. Reflections on good leadership, post-independent nation building in Africa, how leaders are developing peace and prosperity for their country, analysis on the political and macroeconomic performance, the moral and development ideologies, which is basically just political ideologies, but we'll look at this. Look at their national policies, actions, what they did, whether they're good or bad, what's the impact on the people, and how we can promote a stronger African-centered leadership culture in Britain. So we're encouraging you to learn and to be the better leaders of the future. And as we go along, I'll introduce some other things as well, a little bit other, because we got the same people every week, it's good. So I'll introduce you to some other leadership concepts and some other stuff I'm reading at the moment, that people who are analyzing countries in different ways, so we can benefit from some of the analysis that's being made. Remember, for all this, we have the benefit of hindsight. So we have the benefit of looking back and looking at how things have gone. And it's always harder in the moment. I do accept that. But nevertheless, we have to analyze it is what it is. We have to analyze history. And we have 26 years since South Africa has had the modern constitution and the modern period since 94. So one of the things I do want to mention just from the start is I have been to different parts of Africa, never been to South Africa. And the most recent travel was in Rwanda, which we're going to come to later. So I'm not going to spend time on that today. But just at one point has to be made that Rwanda genocide was in 1994. It is the same year that Mandela became the president of South Africa, the same year. So it's really interesting by the time we get to Rwanda to look at the comparisons between how far Rwanda has come with a much weaker base, because South Africa is a much richer country in terms of economy, size of population, and the minerals and resources that are available in South Africa. It's just, there's no comparison. South Africa is the richest country in Africa other than Nigeria, but Nigeria is massively bigger in terms of population. So it's just interesting. We have 26 years to reflect. We haven't got a few years, we've got 26 years. So it's going to be interesting. So let's have a look at some reflections. One of the things I looked at was that the Mo Ibrahim, who's one of the first billionaires in Africa, who had a telecoms empire, he's become quite a philanthropist and quite involved in African leadership. And he has a prize for African leadership. So it seems silly for me to try and come up with some stuff around African leadership that doesn't include the Mo Ibrahim Prize. Not to say he's the model, but there is an existing one that's being used that is actually giving prizes to African former heads of state. And it's quite interesting. So we might as well use that as a baseline, because he doesn't give out the prize every year. The prize has been going for over 10 years and he's only given out about 5 or 6 prizes. So in other words, he hasn't felt, or the foundation hasn't felt, that the leadership in Africa has been good enough, that former heads of states have been good enough to be given the award some years. So that kind of almost a sad reflection of the current reality in Africa. But remember, it is former heads. So if you're a current leader in Africa, a current president in Africa, you can't get the prize because you're not a former head. So that does potentially can give us hope that some of these leaders, once they step down, may well get the prize sometime later. So one of the things they looked at the challenging circumstances, so the context, in how they're developing their country, the strengthening of democracy or not, and the human rights. Now, one of the things you'll have to understand with my analysis on human rights is we have to be very careful when we talk about human rights. The West describe human rights in a very different way to how I think we should describe human rights. Now, I think we should describe human rights the way the UN describes human rights and the way most human rights charters are written, not the way Western leaders interpret the term human rights. And the reason why I make this is very important that we make this distinction. So when the West talk about human rights, they predominantly talk about freedom of speech and freedom of association. That's their big issue. Now, if any of you understand human rights in the true sense, which is the right to healthcare, the right to education, the right to equality of women, the right to housing, all these kind of rights, the rights of human beings to have access to water, you know, access to sanitation, access to all those basic things like food, you know, dignity, those things, freedom of worship and association, all those other things are, if you look at, I don't know if some of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but look it up. And maybe one week I'll put a slide up on it. The Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that where people are very, very poor, which is most parts of Africa, a large percentage of the population are very poor, on the list of what's important, the freedom of association and the freedom of speech is not going to be at the top. Now, in the context of South Africa, of course, because of apartheid, it was a major issue because apartheid stopped Africans from freedom of association, banned us from organizing, banned us from elections, and they ruled over us as a settler colonial government. So obviously, freedom of association and democracy was a major, major part of the struggle. So the context here is not necessarily the same as the context in other situations, but all post-colonial governments obviously had a different democracy to the pre-colonial, because during the colonial times, obviously they were ruled over by other people. So that is the context of it, but it's not the primary goal. The goal of rights of freedom of association and democracy is because the people believe that if they have democracy and they have freedom of association, they'll be a better country. But the evidence of this is not quite clear. There isn't a clear distinction between countries that have democracy and freedom of speech and the conditions of the people. So when we look at other countries, you'll see what I mean. But if you give a simple example between, say, Cuba, which is relatively poor economically, and you could criticize, or some people would criticize, the so-called freedom of association and freedom of speech, but the conditions of the people, all their basic needs are met, and the state ensures they're met, and there's a level of equality in society. If you look at China, similarly, you can criticize China for freedom of association, democracy, but in terms of the basic human needs over the last 40 years since the reforms, a lot of them have been met by the vast majority of the population. So there's different models. But if we look at capitalism generally, which is most countries in the world who have so-called democracy and so-called human rights, as in freedom of association, the people live dirt poor. So there isn't a direct correlation between getting democracy and getting so-called, what I call middle-class human rights, and having a decent life. It's not necessarily one doesn't go with the other, as they would argue it does, but it doesn't. So that's an important concept. So how sustainable and equitably prosperous is the country? And what we mean by that is equitable as in obviously how wealth is distributed, how prosperous they are in terms of just generally as compared to other countries, but also is it sustainable? Because you have some places where they have some good growth and then it stagnates. South Africa is an example where it's stagnated quite substantially. Exceptional role models for the continent. So are they role models for the continent? Well, you'll see my conclusions at the end, and I think you will understand my conclusions when I finish, but we'll judge that later. Is the South African leaders being exceptional role models? I'm sure everybody knows Mandela, so you'd be intrigued to see my views of Mandela and what evidence do we have to say, is he exceptional or not? That would be an interesting one. And ensures that the African continent continues to benefit from their experience and wisdom. So the prize is given to African leaders who, once they leave government, continue to help Africa, basically. Okay? So it's not so relevant, massively relevant to South Africa, but it's a little bit, because obviously Mandela passed away, but Mbeki's still alive. And of course, Zuma's still alive. Zuma's a little bit early, but what has Mbeki been doing in terms of helping Africa? So maybe we can ask that question, which I'm not sure I know the answer, but anyway, that's one to be thought about. Now, I put what else, because I don't feel this is comprehensive enough for existing leaders. I think we need to go a bit wider. So I'm going to add some things on. So I'm going to add on honest, but I don't like the word honest on its own, because your honest and my honest and somebody else's honest could be a matter of opinion. My way of looking at honest is, are they corrupt or not? Not just are they corrupt, but is their government corrupt? Because you can have an individual like Donald Trump, for example, who can be a billionaire. Well, Donald Trump doesn't take a salary. And you could argue, well, he's not corrupt because he doesn't need any money. He doesn't take any money from the government. So there's no evidence that Trump is stealing money from the government, but there could be corruption amongst his people. There could be corruption amongst the people he's appointed. There could be loads of corruption going on in the government. Just because he personally isn't corrupt, because he's a billionaire, does not demonstrate that the government's not corrupt. So political leadership is not just about the individual, it's about the government as a whole. Is there clear social progress? Is the society generally progressing? And we have to look at what is the position of women. We can't just look at social progress and just look at men. We have to look at women as well. Have they left a strong economy behind? So when these leaders leave office, how strong is the economy? So that's another one to judge good leadership. Have they left good, strong, and good institutions? Now, one of the countries we're not looking at, but one of them would be interesting, was Libya. Now, there's a lot of positives I could say about Libya under Gaddafi in terms of the development of the country, the standard of living, the way money was used, the Pan-Africanist role that he played. There's lots of positives you could say about Libya under Gaddafi. But the one thing was not strong was institutions. So when he left, or when he was killed, the institutions have collapsed and the whole society has collapsed around, because the institutions were too much dominated by him as an individual. So there's an issue with strong and good institutions that we need to leave behind. And what Pan-African policy direction have they taken? So for us, good leadership, it's not enough to look at good leadership and have a micro approach to African economy. What is the situation and what is that leader doing, or the leaders doing in Africa, that is contributing to the development of Africa as a whole? Nobody would call a great European leader a leader who was totally anti-Europe, and who had, or not anti-Europe in language, but did nothing to help Europe. To be a great leader in Europe, you would expect them to be contributing to the development of Europe. Or a good leader in Asia, wouldn't you expect them to contribute to the development of Asia, not just their own country? So why shouldn't we look at that as well? The next one is, do they have any succession planning? So when they leave office, does the whole thing collapse? Does everything fall apart? And that's a big problem as well. We don't want one man, one woman leadership where you have a great leader or potential great leader, and then when they leave or they die, everything collapses, because again, they haven't left good institutions and there's no succession planning. Okay, so the program, as you know, is Azania, South Africa this week, and these are the next ones. So next week will be Ghana, then Zimbabwe, then Rwanda, Ethiopia. Some really interesting places that I'm going to be doing some serious work on. Some of these I know better than others. I know Azania, Ghana, Zimbabwe, Rwanda very, very well. Ethiopia, Botswana, and Sudan I've got to do a bit more work on, but I'm sure I'll come up to speed by the time we get to those weeks. And it will be an interesting, as I said, it's my objective. I'm trying to be as objective as I can looking at these areas. So let's go on to South Africa. So South Africa, we all know where South Africa is, but just for the sake of the map, it's worth just having a look. And it's the maps that are political maps. This is what we call a geopolitical map, not just we're not looking at mountains here. We're looking at the political reality. So we can see some crazy stuff because of colonialism here. We have Lesotho in the middle of South Africa and Swaziland on the edge of South Africa. Completely mad. Nobody would plan to have countries in this way, where you still have African, predominantly male, it's all male, isn't it? Kings running these places, which is absolutely nonsensical situation in the middle of South Africa. Just makes no sense whatsoever, Lesotho and Swaziland to be running the way they are. And there are issues in their own right, but we're not going to talk about those tonight. So on the left, we have Namibia, which got its independence, and I'll show later how they got their independence directly as a result of the fight for South African independence, and the fact that a very important other legacy is the Cubans' involvement in that directly led to the defeat of the South African whites and led to the independence of Namibia, which we'll come on to later. You have Zimbabwe just slightly north on the other side, which is also very important because Zimbabwe gave a lot of support to the South African struggle what they used to call the frontline states, the South African states, which is this southern area here, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Namibia predominantly. Botswana predominantly is not so politicized and we're not so involved in liberation struggles, but Botswana is a very stable economy right next door and a very stable democracy right next door to South Africa. And then you have Mozambique to the right, which had to go through their own armed struggle. So you have Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique all having to go through armed struggle to get their independence, because South Africa still had control and interference in those governments and supported the Western insurgencies into those governments and gave them military and other support to try and stop the progressive governments in those areas. So this is all part of the geopolitical landscape. But just for facts, you know, the population of South Africa is similar to the population of the UK, about 60 million people. But the very significant figure, which I thought I had to add, is there's still 4 to 5 million white people living in Azania, South Africa, which is a very large part of the population. So that's very important. The settler colonialism. Now, there's people you can tell their political situation by the way that they describe South Africa. Now, the Africanists, we describe South Africa as a settler colony. In other words, the Europeans in South Africa are settlers. They have settled in South Africa. So it's not just colonization, because Ghana and all the other countries had colonialization, but they didn't have a large settlement of Europeans. Now, there's lots of reasons why this might have happened, partly because it's defendable, because it was so far south, it had less chance of invasion, but also the temperature and the climate in South Africa is much more friendly to people who are not used to a very warm climate. So if you know anything about South Africa, you know that the temperature is probably closer to a Southern European sort of temperature than it is to West Africa or Central Africa or North Africa. It's not a boiling hot country. It's not desert and boiling hot all the time. So that might be part of it, but that doesn't justify it. So we call them settler colonial government, because they settled in large numbers and took over the government and run it for their own interest. And it's capitalist, which is just, again, a fact. These are just facts. There's not opinions, they're facts, because it is a capitalist country and it remains capitalist in terms of its predominant leaning towards the free market and its association with other capitalist countries around the world, and its historical relationship with some of the more brutal capitalist nations like America, the UK, Israel, places like that, which I'll come back to in a bit. So just going through this, I won't try to spend too much time on it, but the history is very, very important in South Africa before we get to the modern times, because it's very, very critical we understand the context. We'll get reasonably up to date pretty quickly, but just for context, the first white settlement was very, very long time ago. This is very different to, as I said, other parts of Africa, because the numbers of whites were in mass numbers very early on, predominantly Dutch Europeans. And this goes to show when you get these European countries like Holland and Germany and other countries say, we never colonized anybody. Well, that's not true. So the Dutch East India Company, check the name, the Dutch East India Company. Why is it an East India Company and it's Dutch? Because the Dutch were in India, exploiting India. And the exploitation in those days was done through businesses. The Dutch East India Company was basically an extension of the Dutch state and sponsored and supported by the ruling classes of Holland. And that relationship was to extend into South Africa to further try and exploit Africa because of its minerals and resources. And that's how it first started in Africa. And that shows how long ago. We're talking hundreds of years ago. And this is the contradiction where you get some European settlers in South Africa calling themselves Africans, which is absolutely nonsensical. They're Europeans in Africa. They're not Africans because they were born there. They're Africans. They're Europeans. Just like we're Africans, because even though we're born in Europe, we're still African. We're not European. It doesn't matter what your passport says. That doesn't make you who you are. You can give a passport to a cat. Doesn't make it a dog. Okay, so it's very important we understand this. The Boers, that's what they describe themselves as. So the Boer War. So the Boer War was fought with the British. So I'm bringing you up to date because I don't want to spend too much time on the history and that particular period of history. But basically, Britain was a superpower. It had the empire. and it fought the Boer War to take control of South Africa. And in those days, it wasn't even one country. It wasn't even it was like a principality of different parts. And the Union of South Africa was created when the British took power through the British Empire as long ago as 1910. And they called it a sovereign. It became a sovereign state later on when the British gave them the status of the Union Act and became a sovereign state, although it wasn't quite independent, but a kind of pseudo-independent state. This is the kind of the contradiction, a bit like America, where America ruled, Britain ruled America, even though they were both Europeans and of the same kith and kin. But eventually, the white American dominant Americans still sought to overthrow, which was the American Revolution, to overthrow the British, where the British burnt down the first White House, to overthrow the British so you could get American independence. So American independence was fought against the British. So this is just the relevance of this context here. So the real contradiction in South Africa was imperialism and capitalism, because South Africa, as the white settler colonial government, could have only existed because America and Britain predominantly supported it and allowed it to do what it was doing, because they directly benefited from the exploitation of the minerals, the gold, the diamonds, and all the resources in South Africa. So there was a direct relationship. So it's very important we understand this, because then when we look at the politics later on, we'll see the contradiction here is directly linked to imperialism and capitalism. And this is where you'll start to begin to see my opinion of the leadership in South Africa start to emerge. Because those in South Africa who saw apartheid as the problem, we believe were misguided. Apartheid is only a symptom of a wider political problem. The wider political problem was imperialism and capitalism. Apartheid was just a symptom of that to make it a more extreme version of capitalism and imperialism by forcing Africans into Bantustans, into their own little area, so the Europeans could take over the country and have all the best land and the best areas, and give Africans virtually nothing and just make them virtually like a slave state. So that's very important to understand that apartheid is just a symptom. You get rid of apartheid, you still have the capitalist system, you still have imperialism, is what we have today. So apartheid only officially began in 1948. If you think how long ago that was, so 300 years, Europeans ruled South Africa for 300 years over the Africans before apartheid started. So was apartheid the contradiction, or the 300 years of occupation and exploitation the problem? Apartheid was just a modern manifestation of a more extreme version of what they already did. They just made it more crude, that literally like South Africa, where you had blacks can't go here, only whites can go here, you queue at this bus stop, you sit at this bench, you can only drink from this fountain, etc. That literal apartheid was what we saw in America as well. Exactly the same. So let's look at the first stage of the struggle. We put it into two stages. The first stage of the struggle was up to about 1959, and you'll see why shortly. Call this the first stage. This was the non-armed stage. So ANC was formed in 1912, and they had the Defiance campaign. So there was lots of civil rights campaigns. Sorry, this is not coming up in order, but don't worry, it will all come up shortly. The Defiance campaigns that they did, and all the work that they did, was all kind of civil rights based, arguing that that Africans should have the vote and that we should have civil reform. And it was basically a civil rights campaign, which is a non-violent protests and boycotts and kind of just arguing the case. Basically, there was no military aspect to it at this stage. All those years we had different levels of struggle, but it was basically peaceful, or peaceful as in non-violent, and basically asking the government for change and asking the world to support us throughout the United Nations and so on. Now, what became quite significant is by 1952, this is exactly the same situation that happened in Ireland, the same situation that happened in America, the same situation that would have happened everywhere in the world, is that if America didn't grant civil rights to Africans in the 1960s, the country would have been burnt to the ground, or there would have been armed warfare in America. America were a bit smarter, and they realized that the Africans were ready, or we were ready to take America down in the 1960s. So they did two things, which is some of the things they did in the Caribbean as well, places like Jamaica. They put drugs into our community to dismantle our family structures, and confuse the situation. And they, by criminalizing our youth and criminalizing people and making them into druggies and totally dismantling the family structure. And they also tried to destroy all the political organizations. And but what they also did is, by giving the Civil Rights Act, made that a lot of Africans gave up the government, they gave up some of the controls we had, and became less militant, because the government looked like it was our friend. It looked like it was going to help us. Looks like we were becoming Americans again. And that created confusion in the movement, where you had those who were more progressive saying, no, this is not enough. But a lot of people were pacified by the fact, look, the government has given us the right to vote. They're giving us equal legislation, etc. But we all know it's not quite that way. But in South Africa, because they didn't do that, the people just got more and more militant, because there was no stage where they compromised. In fact, they became more extreme with apartheid measures. So there was no compromise at all. So that's why the Defiance Campaign in 1952 is where the ANC, because that was the dominant organization. There were some other organizations as well, but that was the dominant organization at the time. There was also some Indian organizations and some colored organizations, because remember, in those days, the ANC was predominantly, or the African struggle was predominantly what they described as the so-called Africans were so-called dark skin. The mixed race and other Africans were described as coloreds. This was a classification that was structured classification. And unfortunately, many of the people in South Africa still see themselves through that prism. So coloreds in South Africa still see themselves as coloreds rather than Africans. And that's still a lot of confusion there. And that description is still still a significant problem. But anyway, basically it led to a number of freedom demands, which also led to the development of the Freedom Charter, which I'll come to in a bit. But that campaign of 50,000 volunteers into the townships and the countryside to go and consult the people about reforms, about what demands they wanted, was very, very significant. And it escalated the whole situation. And it basically led to the Freedom Charter, which was agreed by the ANC and its allies in 1955. And the Freedom Charter is very, very significant. And we'll have a slide around that shortly, but it's very, very significant, the Freedom Charter. So, sorry that came up the other way, but the emerging African nationalism and the working class, the whole popular resistance, was that whole 50 years of campaigning. Now, South Africa is unusual because South Africa is industrialized by the Europeans. There's a lot of workers in South Africa. So South Africa is quite unique in Africa because it has a substantial working class. In most parts of Africa and most parts of the so-called South, so-called Third World, there isn't a substantial working class. So nearly every revolution in around the world has been peasants. Has not been workers. China, Russia, Cuba, you name it. It's been led by the peasants. Vietnam, all these places in the world, Korea, all the places that have had revolutions in that way, they've all been led by the people in the countryside, the peasant farmers, subsistent farmers, because that's the majority of the population. In South Africa, there's always been a substantial and growing working class who actually had wage labor, working in industrial, mining, and places like that. So they had salaries or wages. Most parts of Africa, people are still semi-subsistence and don't have a wage or a salary from a boss or from a job. Most people just earn from, as I said, subsistence farming. So that's a very different relationship. So South Africa was quite unique in that situation. So that's why working class here is quite a strong term that you generally don't associate with the African struggle in the first part of the 20th century, because majority of Africans were not working class. There wasn't much workers. There was a very small class of workers who were predominantly in the army and in the civil service, and basically public servants like teachers and things like that. And they tend to be the more elite. So they a different structure. Okay. And also the politics in South Africa was dominated by the Afrikaners, which is another word for the Dutch. The Afrikaners is kind of like a crazy term to try and accept that they're kind of somehow African, but they're not. But that was Afrikaner nationalism, which was that kind of Dutch nationalism. But it's also confused because it's mixed up with a lot of British people. There's a lot of British people or English living in South Africa, and a large number of the white people in South Africa are people from Britain. So there's a bit of a mixed situation. So the Afrikaans language wouldn't be spoken by the English people in South Africa. So the Afrikaners were still the dominant nation. And that's why if you see the flag of the old flag of South Africa, there's a link between the Dutch flag with the orange. So some of those similarities. Now, I need to teach you the Africanist line. The Africanist line rejected the Freedom Charter as a model for change in South Africa, because the Africanist line believed and still believe that Africa belongs to Africans and South Africa belongs to Africans. Now, the Freedom Charter says South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Think about this. South Africa belongs to all who live in it. No, it doesn't. Just like Mexico or most of Southern America, and also parts of course, North America, it doesn't belong to Europeans. It belongs to the American Indians, the indigenous peoples. It doesn't belong to the Europeans who live there. Even Europeans who live there, who struggle, who are Spanish and Portuguese origin, are still settler colonial. They're still settlers. Even in South America, in North America, they're not the original people. So when we say who the land belongs to, we're clear. North America, South America, and the Caribbean belong to the original people who live there. Now, who decides to own it and who uses it today and who agrees is a different issue. But who owns it is clearly, who owns South Africa should be Africans. That's our position on the Africanist line. That doesn't mean you mistreat Europeans. It doesn't mean that you kill Europeans or you chuck them out. It just means that Africans, that we should have our rightful and accept that it's our land and it should be African land, not whoever lives there. That's not the way we see it. So that's a very different position. And also we believe that the land should be returned. 80+% of the land of South Africa is owned by Europeans, which was stolen from our people. And that land has not been returned. And the Africanist line said that we have to have the land back. And the Freedom Charter does not really properly address the return of the land without compensation. Now, remember this term, without compensation, because you can return any land if you've got to buy it back. But if you've got to buy it back, you're not really returning it. If you steal my house and you say I can have it back if I buy it off you, well, how is that fair? How is that justice? Just because your parents stole it from my parents 300 years ago doesn't make it right. Doesn't mean that that makes it okay. So I could never have a house because you stole my house 300 years ago and I live in a shack and you live in opulence and I've got to now buy back my house, which how do I buy it back when I haven't got any money? So this is the contradiction that we need to see in the South African context. So the overall struggle all this time was supported by Africans. So as Africans got their independence, remember the first African countries only got independence in the 1950s. So most of that period of this period of struggle was where all the different African countries were struggling almost on their own without a unified position. It was only in 1945 that we had the 5th Pan-African Congress that brought together Africans from around the world. Prior to 1945, most of the struggles were quite independent of each other. Remember, there was no internet, mobile phone. There was no way of communicating between African countries easily. Most African countries, the only way to communicate was back through Europe and back down through Africa. You couldn't just bring somebody from South Africa to Ghana or fly a plane from one to the other. So communicating between African countries was very difficult. But African countries, as they became independent, were very supportive of South Africa and the struggle against apartheid and against the white domination, which you'll see shortly. So let's get back to the next level. I'm not going to go too much into this, but this is just literally a copy. You can go on the internet and you can literally see this charter. I've put the term, is it a liberal charter or is this a freedom charter? Now, I would say it's a liberal charter, not a freedom charter, because how do you have freedom if you don't have resources? How do you have freedom if you don't have the land? How do you have freedom if the land that's stolen, 80% of the good land of South Africa is still in the hands of the people who occupied our country? I can't see how this is a charter for freedom. I see this as a civil rights charter, which is not good enough. We don't want civil rights. We want our human rights, our inane rights as African people. So let's have a look at this Freedom Charter. It's a statement of core principles, and you can see the alliances there: Indian Congress, the South African Congress of Democrats, and the Colored People's Congress. This is the names they had then. So it was a coalition, and you see there's no Africanists. In 1955, there was no political party that represented the Africanist line, the Pan-Africanist line. There was no party that had that position. And the South African Communist Party, I'm not going to get much into it today, but the South African Communist Party was also emerged and has always had a strong alliance with the ANC, although the ANC has never really been communist or socialist, but they've had communists or socialists in it. So Let me just put them all up. South Africa belongs to who lives in it. So I see that as a major problem with that principle. South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And that is in the South African constitution today, which I still think is an area for contestation and should be challenged. Okay. And the South African government banned the ANC and arrested 156 activists, including Mandela, who was put on the famous 1956 treason trial. Now, remember, history is often written by the oppressor. Now, we have to write our own history. Mandela was not the only person who served 27 years in prison. Mandela became a symbol that was of the anti-apartheid movement. But we need to understand that the African struggle was not about Mandela. It was a coalition of forces, and there was loads of political prisoners, of which Mandela was only one. So we shouldn't get hung up with this one person. There was loads of activists who went on trial at that treason trial, and a number of them were jailed at that time, around the 1950s and 1960s. But I'll come to that in a second. So let's go to the next phase, which is the phase that's most significant and most recent. So the two dominant parties from 1959 to 1994 was the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, often known as the PACA. Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, and the ANC, the African National Congress. These are the two symbols. So let's have a look. So did you know, you probably didn't, and stop me if there's any questions, just jump in, that the PAC was formed by the more radical ANC youth wing. Yes, the more radical ANC youth wing. Nothing's changed because the EFF today, the Economic Freedom Fighters, came out of the ANC youth wing as well, but we won't get into that now. But the ANC youth wing in 1959 was not happy with the position of the ANC, was not happy with what the Freedom Charter, and they formed, under the leadership of Robert Sobukwe, they formed the PAC. So the PAC was formed out of the ANC, and the most militant aspects of the more progressive Africanists in the ANC formed the PAC. So let's keep going. Oh, sorry, I don't know why these aren't in order. I'll correct that next time. Let me just put them all up. So the one of the big things that happened was the Sharpeville massacre. A number of you should know about this. That the PAC was only 1 year old, was less than 1 year old, and it got banned. So the PAC was never allowed to really openly organize itself in South Africa until the 1990s. So for the first 30 years of the life of the PAC, they couldn't organize openly in South Africa, as the ANC had 60 years or 50 years of organizing before the PAC. So there's a significant difference. So this gathering of 20,000 people, this was also led by people in the PAC. The PAC, see, it's written out of history. Even if you Google this, most of the Google entries and the Wikipedia, etc., write out the history of the PAC. So it's important we know the history. Now, we're lucky that we have people like Dr. Peko, who used to be the president of the PAC, who I know personally, and I've met him, and I've had been lucky to have personal time with him when he stayed at my place a couple of times, and when he came to the UK. But anyway, he's written books that give another version of history that's very important that we read. Dr. Peko's books of the history of the PAC and the history of South Africa from an Africanist point of view. So anyway, this 20,000 people who gathered to defy the past laws. Now, if you understand apartheid, all Africans had to walk around with a book, just like in America. You had to walk around with a piece of paper that said you had the right to live or travel in different parts of South Africa. This was an easy way to keep on oppressing us, because the police had the constant right to keep on stopping you to say, where's your pass? Where's your pass? Where's your pass? It was a constant harassment and a reason for harassment. So the Africans tore up their passes, walked up to the police station and challenged South Africa. So there was lots of protests around pass laws and lots of arrests around this, deliberate arrests, to make it unmanageable. Now, there was a massacre. We call it the Sharpeville massacre, which is 60 years ago. And that Sharpeville massacre in 1960, they gunned down 69 people, shot them dead, unarmed protesters. They just massacred them. So that's what we call the Sharpeville massacre. Then this led to the massive intensification of the struggle. Absolute massive intensification, because once you murder people like that, gun them down, that's when people realize that peaceful protest is not going to work. And that's when the armed struggle basically came about. So the apartheid government declared a state of emergency. And there was a state of emergency all the way from this period all the way up to 1990. Can you believe that? So there was constant struggle for 40 years, a state of, can you imagine, 40 years state of emergency in South Africa because we were resisting at such lengths. This led to the banning of the ANC and the PAC. So as I said, the PAC was banned after within a year of it even forming. And of course, Sobukwe, who was the first leader of PAC, was put in prison for over 20 years with Mandela and others. And as I said, this led to the armed struggle, which linked to Umkhonto Sizwe, which is what they call MK, and the Azanian People's Liberation Army, which is called APLA. So MK and APLA. MK was the arms, what do you call it? I've forgotten the name. The armed formation of the ANC, and APLA was the armed formation of PAC. In 1966, the UN declared apartheid a crime against humanity. So this is the United Nations now, as more countries of the world were independent. Remember, in 66, still a lot of countries in the world were not independent like we know them now. But there was enough countries in Asia, the Middle East, and in Africa to vote that apartheid was a crime against humanity. But they didn't have the force to tackle the situation. And then the Soweto uprising in 1976 was another famous moment in South African history where young people, the youth, rose up. Because what happened is, and I'll give you a little bit of information context, but when the apartheid government was forcing the youth to learn at school in English and Afrikaans, and the youth just said, no way, we're not doing it. And they just kept fighting and protesting about it. And the Soweto uprising was when a large gathering of young people who were demanding change and saying they're not going to be learning in this, and they were massacred again. Hundreds of them were massacred. And during this period of time, the Black Consciousness movement rose its head. Some of you know Steve Biko. Steve Biko was one of the leaders of the Black Consciousness movement. And this Black Consciousness movement was the movement that developed with the banning of the ANC and the PAC. So let's go into the history of the Soweto uprising just very briefly. This picture on the bottom right is Hector Peterson, who was shot and killed because he was alive here, but he was later died. So the person that's famous is not the person carrying them and the sister, but Hector Peterson. It was a famous picture in South Africa. This was a picture that went all around the world. And when I was young man, this is one of the pictures that haunted me in South Africa, where they gunned down all the young people. And that was Hector Peterson, was a symbol of the oppression of South Africa. Some of you are old enough, or your parents may be old enough to have known. These are the pictures we used to see on TV all the time, where Africans being shot at and beaten in the street, just like in America, that riled up a lot of Africans, just the way George Floyd death has riled us up today. People witnessing those things brutally obviously makes people more radical and more wanting to be politicized. So what happens? The Afrikaans decree in 1974 said that all black schools had to learn Afrikaans and English, or not learn, had to actually be taught in Afrikaans and English, which they rejected, because there's a number of African languages in South Africa, and Afrikaans and English isn't one of them. So this is what happened, and this was 16th of June. So it was just recently, the anniversary of the Soweto uprising was just in 16th of June, just a couple of weeks ago. 23 people, that's what they officially claimed, 23 officially massacred. But there was other estimates of 700 young people, children, gone down in the street, again, unarmed. And it led to a further escalation of the struggle. Can you imagine what was the reaction of the people when 700 people are massacred on the street? Again, just reaffirming the need for armed struggle, because peaceful protest is not working. If you're peacefully protesting and you're being gunned down in the street, there's no way that you can just continue to have peaceful protests when you're being massacred and murdered in the street. It's very, very difficult. And you might remember the films, if you haven't seen them. Cry Freedom was about Steve Biko, and that was a film by Richard Attenborough. And then in 92, there was a musical called Sarafina, where the school teacher was actually Whoopi Goldberg. And it's a fantastic film. Both the Sarafina 1 and 2, absolutely fantastic film that shows the children rising up against having to learn Afrikaans and English at school. So they're very good films. Both of these films are very good historical films that you should worth watching. June 16th, this is embarrassing as far as I'm concerned. June 16th is now a public holiday, but instead of calling it Soweto Day or the Soweto Massacre Day. They call it Youth Day. So it hides the history. Can you see how history can be watered down? Calling it Youth Day, how many youth in South Africa even know the history of what happened when you call it Youth Day? Now, it might be a positive to call it Youth Day rather than a negative. I accept that. But it'd be interesting to know how many young people actually know the significance of that day today. So the internationalization of the South African struggle is worth understanding. And this comes back to when I talk about leadership as well. I'm going to be getting onto that very shortly. So the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle is what it was. It was an anti-colonial struggle, but it was seen as an anti-imperialist struggle by the progressives in the world. Socialist governments and progressive governments around the world were very anti-South African, the white South African government, and they all boycotted them. There was very few diplomatic relationships between white South Africa and the rest of the world. People refused to put embassies in South Africa, refused to have relationship with South Africa, and we'll go on to talk about the boycott on that in a minute. And they understood the land question, that the land needed to be returned to the Africans. It's very, very clear we understood this. So armed support came from places like Cuba and Libya. No surprise that when Mandela came out of prison, the two countries he visited very early on was Cuba and Libya, to say thank you to Cuba under Fidel Castro and Libya under Gaddafi. And when he visited Libya, there was actually an embargo, a Western United Nations embargo by the Security Council, which is basically America, France, and Britain, put an embargo on Africa to not be able to travel to Libya. Can you believe that? These Western countries are telling us we can't travel to our own countries. And Mandela said, I am flying to Libya. Now, most people, what they did is they flew to a state near Libya and then drove into Libya because of the air ban. Mandela said, no way, I'm flying to Libya because it's Africa and I'm flying there. So give Mandela his credit. Lots of Western leaders told him not to go to Fidel Castro and Cuba and not to go to Libya. And he said he decides who his friends are, not other people decide who his friends are. And he went to thank them for their contribution to the struggle in South Africa. And that was all on the world news. There's even a book that that says how far we slaves have come, that was written by between Mandela and Fidel Castro around that whole thing. The international anti-apartheid movement became very liberal, but nevertheless, it was international and very, very important to have what we call allies around the world who supported the anti-apartheid movement and was very, very pivotal in isolating South Africa and bringing it to their knees. So they negotiated. Free Nelson Mandela, the whole chant. If you Google it again, you can hear the songs. It became a song called Free Nelson Mandela, and the whole chant around Mandela, because the anti-apartheid movement decided to make him the key political prisoner, is why he became so famous, and the notoriety around Nelson Mandela and the famous person he became. But the danger with that is it created a kind of a symbol of Mandela being like a god or an angel. And that was the downside of it. But anyway, it was still some important part of the struggle. Dominated by white liberals around the world. But it doesn't mean because they were liberals, they're bad. It just means they were liberals, a lot of them. But also a lot of African nationalists as well. In 1973, the UN declared that apartheid was both unlawful and criminal. Unlawful and criminal. Very significant. So again, to get the world to say this is wrong. But again, even though the world said it's wrong, it was still dominated by America and America, Britain, and Israel, who didn't support the boycott or didn't support the economic embargo on South Africa. In fact, if you remember, Thatcher, who came to power in 1979, never accepted economic sanctions should be on South Africa, and she always described Mandela as a terrorist and would not have anything to do with Mandela. The international boycott and call for sanctions was very, very powerful and crippled South Africa. Diplomatic boycott, and then it also led to the sporting boycott. So if you remember, you might not remember, if you go back in history, there was South Africa were banned from the Olympics, banned from all athletics meets. They were banned from cricket and banned from rugby, which was their main sports. They did football as well, but football was predominantly an African game. So they weren't interested in football. They were interested in cricket, rugby, and athletics, which was dominated by white South Africans. And what the world said was, if you're not going to allow Africans to be in athletics, cricket, or rugby, then we're not going to accept you in sport. And that's what happened. It's because they wouldn't allow any non-whites to be in any of these sports. So, And the world said, no way, we're not having it. We're not having apartheid within our sports. So they banned them from all the sports. And that really hurt South Africa because they were seen as a pariah nation. And the economic boycott actually crippled them. Because I remember Barclays, when Barclay Bank finally pulled out of South Africa, they went public to say they didn't pull out for political reasons. They pulled out for economic reasons. So it wasn't principled. It's just because so many people were pulling their bank accounts out from Barclays and saying Barclays shouldn't be involved in South Africa, that it became uneconomic and they pulled out. And this economic stranglehold on South Africa became what crippled them. And they got to the stage where they had to negotiate. 40 years of crippling the country economically is what led South Africa to come to negotiations. Or 30 years. It's effectively 30 years between 1960 and 1990. Sanctions were resisted, as I said, by UK, Israel, and the USA. And if you can go and read the book, The Secret Relationship Between South Africa and Israel is all well known. Israel's a racist state, and we all know that Israel is an apartheid state as well. Even Jimmy Carter, the former president of the United States, was put under massive pressure by Israel to not name his book Apartheid. He put apartheid on the title when he wrote about Israel, and they pressured him to take it off, and he said, no, he's not taking it off the book. Read the book about the secret relationship between Israel and South Africa all that time. South Africa, let's get up to the modern times. So we're going to go into the more modern times and talk about the leadership at that time. So look at what happened. The president at that time was called de Klerk, and he announced in 1990, because basically we brought South Africa to its knees. South Africa was crippled economically, crippled politically, and crippled in terms, it was just a pariah. White South Africans, anywhere they went in the world, were seen as just a pariah people. So they were just hated by people all around the world. People would shout at them and all sorts of stuff. It was just not nice. So it made it very difficult for them. And that's why they decided they had to negotiate. And that's when de Klerk had the common sense to tell the National Party in South Africa that apartheid needed to come to an end, and we needed to have negotiations with the ANC and other parties, which is the PAC, etc. So at that time, they unbanned the African National Congress, they unbanned the Pan-Africanist Congress, and they unbanned the Communist Party. And of course, they released Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners. But the most famous was Nelson Mandela, because that's the name that everybody knew. People didn't know the names of all the other prisoners. So they didn't know Oliver Tambo. They didn't know all these people's names. They became a little bit famous afterwards, but most of them were not known. They ended the state of emergency, and Namibia also gained its independence. You remember I mentioned earlier that Namibia gained its independence because basically the Cubans and the Africans in South Africa fought the South African forces, which was a very powerful military force at the time. Remember, they're supported by America and Britain and the West. And they were a very powerful political force. And the first time they were militarily defeated was Kuta Karaval, which was the war which the South African forces were defeated by predominantly by the Cubans and the Africans. And what they did is they played a bit of a trick. A lot of the Africans in Cuba were the ones who fought, because they couldn't tell the difference between South Africans, as in Africans, and the Cuban Africans. And Fidel Castro committed the most advanced military aircraft, which they got from the Soviet Union, to defeat them. And of course, the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress didn't have any aircrafts. They didn't have any tanks or didn't have anything. But because Cuba dedicated with the armed struggle by bringing over these military aircrafts, that's what really put licks on the South African army, and therefore they had to retreat, which led to the independence of Namibia, because for the first time, the South African forces left Namibia and gave it their independence. Very significant part of this. Now, Mandela went around the world to thank people. Now, this is significant because I was there. I lived only a mile away from Wembley Stadium when I was growing up. And I took my parents to see Nelson Mandela at Wembley Stadium when Mandela went there to do a speech. I was very proud to be there. And when he finished his speech, I said to my parents, he sold us out. It was just my observation at the time. And I just said to my parents, I think he sold us down the river because of the speech he made. He had the whole world was watching. Everybody in the world on TV, practically around the world, watched this live. He could have said anything. And all he said is he just said thank you to all the British and thank you to all Europe and whatever. And we thought, what's going on here? He should be thanking Africans around the world. And we just couldn't understand is over what we considered the over-conciliatory position coming out of prison. The Inkatha Freedom Party was formed. A lot of people didn't realize the Inkatha Freedom Party wasn't a political party up to this time. It was a movement, but it became a political party because it wanted to try and win the election. And APLA and Nkuntu Sizwe, which are, as I said, MK, they suspended the armed struggle after 29 years. This is just some of the pictures from that time. You see Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela on the left here. You see Winnie Mandela, obviously, she was much younger then. This was back in 1990, so it's a long time ago. This is 30 years ago. Even Mandela wasn't very old at that time, although obviously he had aged in prison. And look at this, symbolic on the right-hand side was where de Klerk and Mandela shook hands because they actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for peace in South Africa because de Klerk gave up apartheid and Mandela didn't, allegedly didn't ask for any reparations or any malice to happen to the Europeans. But the thing is, people always talk about that, but there's nowhere in Africa that anybody has ever had any retribution. There's no, you can't name any post-colonial government who's persecuted Europeans afterwards. Nowhere. Man, even in Zimbabwe, when Mugabe came into power in Zimbabwe, he agreed for the first 5 years or so that, or 10 years, that white people would be allowed in the parliament. And it wouldn't be first past the post. He would just get rid of all the whites. This is how much compromise we often have. So there's never been a history of us persecuting the colonial masters, so-called colonial masters, after we come to power. So that was just the situation. So you could see that even though Mandela was out of prison, we were still being repressed. There were still protests. Mandela still didn't denounce the armed struggle immediately after coming out of prison. And then they went into negotiations. I'm not going to go too much into this. I'll just try and go through this quickly. They had CODESA, which is the Convention for the Democratic South Africa. There was 92 organizations involved initially in the opposition, what they called a Patriotic Front, to get a democratic South Africa. Basically, they wanted an election where everybody could vote equally. And obviously, because the Africans were the majority, it would become the first African-led government. So there was loads of negotiations, but the PAC was not happy. The Pan-Africanist Congress felt that the negotiations was a sham, and that it was dominated by bilateral agreements between the ruling party, which is the National Party, and the ANC, and it was. And the West had funded the ANC. I remember having news clips from the newspapers in those days. Remember, there's no internet then. We didn't have the internet and all that then. From the newspapers, clips that said Sweden, for example, would stop funding the ANC. That's how we knew how many governments were giving money to the ANC. Millions and millions of pounds was donated by Western governments to the ANC because they wanted a friendly government in power. They didn't want the Pan-Africanist Congress in power because the Pan-Africanist Congress was saying we're going to take back the land and take back the gold and all the rest of it. The ANC wasn't saying that, so they wanted the ANC to be in government. So this is the context of the leadership. When we talk about leadership in Africa, we don't just talk about were they a good leader in isolation of these concepts and this situation. How is the leadership ever going to be good if the leaders are happy to have an election with a constitution that says whites can keep the land? I've just never been able to get my head around that. I just don't understand it. So the PAC were calling for neutrality, that the talk should be done neutrally with the UN or the Organization of African Union should be involved. Of course, the ANC was happy to negotiate directly with the ruling party because they had all the cards. The PAC wanted it neutral because they felt that the ANC was going to run away with the party, so to speak. So AZAPA was also another organization I haven't mentioned much about, maybe weaker, but nevertheless, the Azanian People's Organizations also had an armed wing, by the way. They also had an armed wing, and they were also very negative about the whole negotiations. In fact, they boycotted the election as well. And Buthelezi, who was what we call a kind of a Bantustan leader, reactionary, not progressive at all, was still arguing that he wanted a Zulu kingdom and a homeland for the Inkatha, which was completely backward, which basically they wanted like Lesotho. They wanted a kind of a kingdom where he would be the king of that little kingdom, and then you'd have the rest of South Africa. That was never going to happen, and that was never going to be agreed. And the ANC became the main negotiators. And I put the term, were they sellouts? You can decide. So this is what happened. They decided a new constitution, an interim government, a future for the homelands, but that was more or less rejected because they didn't want to have any of this homelands and the structure. That was all got rid of. And the implementation, how the changes would happen in the electoral system. They didn't agree with first past the post. They had proportional representation. So the South African parliament is formed from the number of votes, the percentage of votes you get. That's why the ANC with 60% of the vote gets 60% of the seats. So in the first past the post system in England, if a party got 60% of the vote, they probably have nearly all the seats. So it's a very different political system. So it's probably fairer and more representative having a system like that. But that's how it is in South Africa. But the downside of that means that the political individuals who go for election are more under the cosh of the leadership, because the leadership of the party determines the candidates, not the electorate. See, if the electorate decides the candidates, the electorate can only remove them. But in South Africa, you can remove the candidate and put a different candidate, which means that the party remains powerful, not the people. So that's a significant the negative about proportional representation, or that version of it. Okay, so they had a whites-only referendum in '92, which led to a white-only vote. And they voted yes to support de Klerk to basically end apartheid. So that's how it happened. The reality of negotiations was the talks actually began in 1982, because Mandela was talking to them years before he was released from prison. He was already talking to the government. This is all documented. It's all in the history books. You can go and see it. Mandela was released to a more comfortable prison, and he was already started negotiations behind the scenes. Some people were not sure what was going on, because even the ANC was struggling to find out what was going on, but the Mandela was negotiating well before. And they knew Mandela was going to be a friendly leader come post the election, because some people said Mandela changed in prison, but you don't know your history. Mandela wrote a book in the 1960s before he went to prison, in the 1950s. And in that book, he made it very clear he's not a socialist and he doesn't believe in socialism. So he didn't become something else in prison. He came out of prison and said the same thing he said before he went in prison. So people who said he was changed in prison don't really know your history. And so the Pan-Africanist Congress and the ZAPU boycotted CODESA. So the decisions were made along the way. But all when these talks were going on, there were still massacres. These were the two massacres with numbers still being killed. So there was still torment in the country. And whilst these negotiations were going on. Now, guess who was the chief negotiator? Yes, the current president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. So again, this is why I show you this history. Leaders don't just come from nowhere. The current leader of South Africa was the chief negotiator at the time. He was the very senior leader in the trade union movement, was Cyril Ramaphosa. He became disillusioned with the leadership because he didn't become the president. He didn't get a senior position. So he went into so-called business instead of politics. So for many years, he was actually a so-called businessman rather than a leader and political leader. This is relevant when I go further, because we're looking at leadership in Africa. Now, if Cyril Ramaphosa wasn't in politics, of course he was really in politics, but he wasn't formally in politics. But he was still involved, of course, in the ANC. Now, when we said he was in business, did he start a business? Did he have a shop? Did he start a business from somewhere? Where did he get his money from? So there's a question there. Go and do the research. He was given seats on boards and given positions and shares. Now, why would rich white people predominantly give this man millions and millions of pounds to be on their board and millions of pounds? Why would they give him that money? Just a question. So when we talked about leaders, you remember what I said before, honest and corrupt? Well, I can't say he was corrupt because I can't say he stole the money from the government. The money was given to him by economically, but I can say that money wasn't given to him for no reason. So I will still call it corruption. If people give you money as a political person, they give you money for a reason. They're not giving you money with no tags. There's nothing, as they say, no such thing as a free lunch. So this is very relevant later on. Now, Chris Hani was a very dominant leader in MK, in the military wing, and he was very strong socialist in the ANC. And he was encouraged to move from exile into what was a dominantly white area. I have no idea why or who convinced him to do that. Within no time, he was assassinated. Now, conspiracy theorists among you may be wondering, why was Chris Hani, the most radical leader in the ANC, assassinated in '93, just before the elections? He was the most radical person in the ANC and calling for a socialist government, calling for the redistribution of land. And guess what? He was assassinated a year before the election. Interesting. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy, but it was very convenient. that he was assassinated a year before the election. And as I said, the ANC was given millions. So leadership of the ANC, millions from Western governments, not millions from progressive governments, millions from Western governments. Now, why was the ANC given all this money? Now, I know because I was around and I had sources that were directly to the leadership and had connections with the ANC, AZAPO, and the PAC. I won't tell you how, but nevertheless, I had those connections. And I knew directly from organizers of the PAC in the UK that PAC were offered money by America if they dropped the land question. And PAC refused to drop the land question, so they got no money. And the electoral reform, or the electoral body that was in South Africa, were allowed to give money to the political parties running for the election, but the PAC got the money about a week before the election, whilst the ANC was having rallies, spending millions of pounds on posters, buses, campaigns on the radio, on the TV, and all across the country, just like you would in England, with millions of pounds that they had, with T-shirts and all the campaigning, whilst the PAC had no money and had virtually nothing to campaign with. When at the time of the election, the PAC and the ANC were similar size, very strong political parties. By the end of the elections, the PAC was obliterated virtually and ANC became the dominant party. Look up your history, check it out. Now, let's have a look at some details here. Here's Mandela voting on the top left at the election. And if you see the election results, so you saw African National Congress won 65, nearly 66% of the vote. Then the Democratic Alliance, which is a kind of pseudo nationalist party, that was kind of the old reformed nationalist party. The Congress of the People, I don't even know who they were. The Inkatha Freedom Party, Independent Democrats, and some others. So quite clearly dominated by the ANC. Look at the people queuing to vote. At that time, it was very major. And this is I think this is when Mandela was finally became the president. This is Oliver Tambo, Gresham, Oliver Tambo and his wife, I think, and also Winnie Mandela there. New constitution that came up, and it's slightly been amended in 97. Let me just put these up. ANC won by a massive vote. I think it was actually not 62, it was more. It was more like 66%, wasn't it, from that slide. I even forgot this, that when Mandela came to power, his deputy presidents was actually de Klerk and Thabo Mbeki. So de Klerk was actually part of the government at the time. Although he was marginalized, it was more symbolic. But it was still agreed that de Klerk was a vice president. That was part of the agreement. Very strange. So the ANC had the dominant of the seats, and the new constitution of South Africa was there, and the Freedom Charter, which I mentioned earlier, became a dominant part of the constitution. So when we say leadership, when leadership negotiate a new constitution, what's the constitution doing? So we said leaders should be around some of these concepts of what is the position of the people? What is the economic situation? Is it improving the people? So we're going to come to some of that shortly. So willing buyer, willing seller, I don't understand that as a concept at all. So as I said, you stole my land, and now I can only get it back if I buy it back off you, if you want to sell it to me at market prices. So the land might be worth £100 million today. How is that ever going to work? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever to me. And of course, land hasn't been redistributed in South Africa because obviously, who's a willing buyer and willing seller? They're not going to sell the land to somebody who's got no money. So the land hasn't been redistributed. So of course, the government needs to do it. So it makes no sense, this willing buyer, willing seller. This is one of the big demands of basically the economic freedom fighters, by the way, and the Africanist line in South Africa today. So modern South Africa. This is how we review leadership, is what you do, not just what you say. So clearly, modern South Africa adopted a strongly pro-market approach to land reform, which is the willing buyer, willing selling concept. I'll come back to that. This is just an example of contrast. Look at this beautiful house on the left, modern house looking very European inspired. And this is a township on the right-hand side where Africans predominantly live. This is the reality in South Africa still today, that a lot of the Africans live in townships and poverty. Look at the state of this on the right-hand side and look at this on the left-hand side. John Pilger did a program back in the 90s, I think it was the late 90s. And John Pilger is a famous journalist, progressive journalist based in, he's Australian. and he interviewed the whites in South Africa and the blacks in South Africa, and he didn't tell them who he was or what he was doing. But so they just were very honest with him, and they said it was amazing what had happened. They thought there was going to be a bloodbath. They thought there'd be retribution. They thought they would lose their house and land. And they said it's been fantastic with Mandela as president because they kept all their land and their house, and life is great. They said they can go around the world and travel. Nobody calls them names. Their sport was all unbanned. You can play rugby, cricket, athletics. They could travel anywhere. All the bans were lifted. And they said, it's brilliant. It's been fantastic. And then he went to the blacks who were living in no shack with a shack, no electricity, no housing, proper housing, no proper running water, shacks for schools, no proper social care, no jobs. I mean, it's a joke. So you can see the contrast, what John Pilger did by showing how the whites live and how the blacks live. Any questions so far? We got any questions there, Nigel? Anything come up yet? Okay, I'll keep going. Right, I'll just keep going. If there's any feedback, let's just check. Ah, okay. So happy to have a pause for some questions. I got a message there from Nigel. I'm just checking the message. I might have to unmute him. Okay. So let me just stop this for a second. You should be on there, Nigel.
Hi, sorry. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation so far. Absolutely jam-packed with critical information and analysis. I'm loving it. We have two questions in the chat. One from Kim Dale, who wants you to go over the bit that you mentioned about Parliament. Can you go back over the Parliament?
Okay.
I think that was about the representation, 60% and first past the post.
Yeah.
And the second question was, why does the party have more power in this form of government? So kind of related there. And someone asked, what's his name? So I don't know if they quickly want to ask, say who they're referring to, which section of the presentation that they are referring to, because obviously you've mentioned so many names before. But yeah, those are the two questions we've got so far.
No problem. So let's deal with the first one. When we talk about the Parliament in the UK, you have first past the post. What first past the post means, we have constituencies of around 60,000, roughly 60,000, 100,000, depends on how it's made up, but roughly equal sized constituencies across the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom has 60 million people, which is about the same as South Africa, and it's divided into 650 constituencies. Now, each of those constituencies are independent. Independent in the sense that when you vote, you as in just me or you, anybody who's 18 who can vote in this country, you vote within a constituency. You don't vote nationally, you vote in that constituency. So as long as the person that you voted for has more than 50% of the vote, that person wins that seat. It doesn't matter what happens in any other part of the country, you win the seat there. So in England, you could, and it has happened in 1945, and it happened again in the 1950s, not 45, sorry, in 1950, and it happened again later, where the Conservative Party in this country had less votes than Labour in 1950, but the Conservatives won the majority, because you can still win a majority because you won more of those constituencies, even though the percentage of your vote was low. So I'll give you an example. I can't go into too much detail, but I'll give you an example. In 97, when Blair won a massive majority of 179, he only won about 42% of the vote. But because he won so many constituencies, he won a massive majority of seats. Now, under proportional representation, what it's done is it's done more on a percentage basis. So instead of you voting by a constituency, you vote nationally. So what they do is they just count everybody's vote across the whole country and say, right, the ANC gets 66% of the vote, so you get 66% of the seats. Now, if they did that in England, Boris Johnson would not have a majority government today. He would have got 40, he won about 40% of the vote at the election last year. So he would get about 40% of the seats. So the only way he could have power is if he had a coalition with the Lib Dems or Labour or somebody. So that's the difference. So it's not that you have more power in South Africa, you actually have less power in South Africa. So in England, you have more power with a small number of a small number of votes, percentage of votes, because you can have a large number of seats. So I hope that makes it clear. It's very, very different voting system. So if the ANC was in England, it probably would have a majority of 300 because the voting system would allow them to have dominate the seats, even though they only had 66% of the vote. So if you look at the majority of Boris Johnson, he has a majority of 80, which is very strong, but he only got 40% of the vote. So how does he have a majority of 80 when he only got 40% of the vote? It's because the electoral system in Britain heavily advantages the big parties. And you'd have to look into it more statistically, but basically that's the system. So Boris looks like a very strong government, even though he's only got 40% of the seats, but the country says he's legitimate leader, but he's not really legitimate. That's like Trump is the president of the United States, and he lost to Hillary by 3 million votes. So it's just the quirk of the electoral system. Any other questions?
Yes, chime me in. Chime me in.
Another call?
Yeah.
Oh, you're in. Okay,
so are there any other approaches to voting other than the two that you have mentioned? Does this favor conservatives in Euro countries? So two questions, two follow-ons from what you were explaining.
It tends to, because if you look at Europe that has proportional representation, remember there's different types of proportional representation, not one type. There's a number of different types. So some have a bit of constituency and a bit of the national vote, and then they have a top up. It's a little bit complicated, but basically most parts of Europe have proportional representation. Therefore, there's very few governments ever in Europe, apart from dictatorships, but there's very few governments in Europe that were ever much to the left or much to the right. Because they have to be a coalition, you never really get a very right-wing government in Europe or a very left-wing government in Europe. So what you tend to get is a kind of centrist, social democratic kind of government. So Germany, France, all these countries are dominated by social democratic governments because the parliament is made up of a coalition, because nobody ever gets power. So even if you look at Angela Merkel in Germany, she's never had a majority. She's always had a coalition. So her policies can never be kind of very right-wing because she has to have the vote of others. But in Britain, because you got first past the post, whoever wins, winner takes all. So therefore, you can have a very right-wing government like Thatcher or Boris Johnson, or a very left-wing if Corbyn had won, or a Labour government that was in 1997. But under proportional representation, it's more difficult to do that because you have to have 50% or more of the total electorate to win to have a majority. So that's why proportional representation is argued by a lot of people to be fairer. It's much a fairer way of doing it because it represents the whole of the country.
Wonderful. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right. So we'll go back to presenting through the slides. Let me do, is it still screen sharing? Yeah. Oh, okay. I'll share back the slides again. And I'll show the slides. Just let me know, Nigel, if you want me to come in again. I'll check my phone, see if there are any texts or anything comes up. And let's put it on full screen. So I was just showing you an example there. I hope you can see this. It might be a bit small depending on what you're using. I hope you're using a laptop or something. But basically, it shows poverty. South Africans living below the poverty line. You can see it's a little bit of a mixed picture here. So this only goes back to 2006. But even in 2006, which was a long time after 94, there is, what's that? I've got to take my glasses off now. 66% of the population in poverty, right? And 28% in extreme poverty, right? That was in 2006. Look, by 2015, it hasn't really changed that much. We're still at 55% living in poverty and 25% in extreme poverty. So even though South Africa is one of the richest countries in the world, with diamonds and gold and all the resources, phenomenal resources, BMW and all these cars are made in South Africa, and they've been there for years. It's industrialized. They've got all the mines, and the people are living in such poverty. You look at this graph now, this graph here, this says BBC stats on how unemployment rates have changed. Okay, so you look at unemployment rates here. This is Africans. Okay, this is the Africans one here, and this goes to whites. So African unemployment has gone from 45% to 30%, which is enormous still. 30% unemployment is absolutely enormous. If you think that we make up nearly 50 million people, if you're talking about 30% unemployed of 50 million, that's a lot of people, right? Remember, the whites only make up 4.5 million, so 7% unemployed. And then it went up to, this is from apartheid 94 to 2018. So the difference is 0.5%. So white unemployment has gone up, what, 0.8% since apartheid ended. So it virtually hasn't even moved. So the level of unemployment amongst white people in South Africa has hardly changed. But the level of unemployment about Africans, you would have expected it to improve, but it hasn't improved that much, from 45% to 30%. For coloreds, 24% to 21%. And for so-called Indians and others, 17% to 12%. So who's made the biggest gains? Yes, the Africans, but we're the majority, so you'd expect that. But it's still massive unemployment. So when we look at leadership, the economic system they're using isn't working because the majority of people are still poor. Why is poverty still at this rate after 26 years in a very rich nation? Because wealth is not redistributed in South Africa. There is no system in South Africa of redistribution other than the Black Empowerment Program. And the Black Empowerment Program is predominantly like the system they had in America, where they said 10%, I think it was 10% of the government jobs and 10% of contracts and stuff had to go to African Americans. But it only really has benefited the middle class. So what we see in America is the same problem. We see a very large, wealthy, middle class African Americans. And when I say large, I don't mean large in proportion to the population. I mean large only in millions. So even if you have 5 million rich African Americans, that means you still got 25 million who are not rich or more. So the point I'm saying is it looks like they're very wealthy because there's a lot of them, and because we see a lot of them on TV because they're sports stars, and we see a lot of rich African Americans. So it makes us look like a lot of Africans are very wealthy in America, when actually the majority of Africans in America are not rich, middle class to poor, working 2-3 jobs, etc. And if you've been to America as many times as me, you can see people queuing for food. The poverty is unbelievable in some places. So, and they're using the same political system, the same type of leadership, the same the same neoliberal policies. And I'll show you, I've got a report that I've actually got from the ANC that they actually wrote in 2012, analyzing themselves. So I'm going to share some of that with you now. This is the review, because it was 100 years after the ANC was formed in 2012. I got a copy of this document. It's a public document. This document was called the Organization Renewal, Building the ANC as a Movement for Transformation and Strategic Center of Power. It said, and these are all quotes from the paper, okay? The people first should be our dictum right into the future. That is what it says in that paper. People first. You see, all this is rhetoric. See, when you're a leader, you can come out with all these words, but it doesn't mean anything. The people first. What does it mean? The people first. It's just hot air. If the people haven't come first, because 30% of Africans live in poverty, and if 30% of Africans live in poverty in a very rich country, I don't know how you would explain that is putting the people first. It's not putting the people first. People in South Africa have swimming pools, Bentleys, expensive cars, and live in opulence, and then you've got 30% living in poverty. How is that possible? Saying the people are first, not the people first. It says we have to replenish our movement's capacity to connect with the people. So they accepted that the ANC has lost its connection with a lot of the people. And they said it's the principal task of the ANC is to mobilize all strata and classes, including the new social forces born out of democracy, around the national program of transformation. What's the national program of transformation? There isn't one. There isn't a national program of transformation. There is a program of reforms, a program of neoliberal policies of, if we earn enough money, we will help the poor. It's like me saying, well, if I get a good enough job, I'll feed my children. If I don't get a good enough job, well, maybe they're not going to get dinner every day. Maybe they're not going to get to go to school, or maybe they can't have healthcare. But if I get a better job, then maybe I'll give them a little bit more. And if I get even a better job than that, I'll give them a little bit more. That's not the way you look after your people. If you put a people first, if I'm poor, my children will eat before I eat. My children will get education if I have to do 5 jobs. That's a people first approach. Parents do not say, well, if I earn 100,000 a year, then my children will have something decent to eat and clothes on their back. But if I only earn 25,000 a year, well, some of my kids are going to have to go without. That's the way these governments are. That's what neoliberalism is. Let us earn enough wealth first. And what that means is the rich earn enough wealth first, and then we'll trickle some down to the poor. But we need to keep on earning the wealth to trickle it down to the poor. The problem is South Africa is hardly growing as an economy, which I'll show you in a minute with a slide. So it also says they claim to be critical of neoliberalism. In this paper, the ANC is critical of neoliberalism, but guess what? The ANC, how is the ANC critical of neoliberalism when they're the government? So when they did the review in 2012, they're reviewing themselves and saying we don't like neoliberalism, but they're implementing neoliberalism. I don't really get that. The majority of poor are African women, but I saw nothing in the paper that actually addressed the fact that the majority of poor African women, the number of rapes in South Africa is phenomenal. I think it's the highest country proportion in the world where women are raped and girls are raped. What have they done about it? What's the proportion of women in the government and so on? Very low numbers. So what's happened in that time? And as I said, and I will show you when we do it later, in Rwanda, more than 50% of the government, of the minister, of the MPs are women. 50% of the ministers are women, and women dominate all aspects of Rwandan life. How many women were raped in Rwanda in the last year? I don't know what the numbers are, but it's a minuscule number. How many people, women, live in poverty in Rwanda compared to the men? So this is the contradictions that we see here. And they were absolutely silent. This silent shift from transformative politics to palace politics. This is what they called it. What does palace politics mean? What the ANC meant was that they spent too much time trying to get power and trying to get elected than worrying about the liberation struggle. And they've said this in their paper. They need to move back to the principles, what they got elected to do, and not focusing on just becoming elected. So there's their own review. So you can read it yourself. So let's look at some of the progress. This is their own paper. So I'm using their own document. So you can't say I'm biased, okay? I wanted to use their own paper in 2012, what they claim. 2.8 million houses built. Now, in a population of 58 million people, 2.8 million houses sounds good, but 2.8 million houses still is not enough compared to how many people live in the country. And you might say, well, how do you build so many? Well, you got to find a way, because when you've got a country with so much wealth, you need to find a way of redistributing that money so you can build more houses for people. Or you just say, well, there's nothing we can do. People just live in a shack. Increase electricity from 58% in 96 to 80% in 2009. So some progress there. Increase access to running water. You know, so there's been progress made. Okay, we accept that. I'm not saying there wasn't. There is progress made. More people getting social grants from 3 million to 15 million. The question you could ask yourself is, why do we need to give 15 million people social grants? So it's one thing, it's good that they're giving them if they need them. But why do 15 million people need social grants? Because they haven't got enough money to live. So why isn't the government providing enough jobs and helping with enough job stimulation for people to feed themselves? Increase access to education and healthcare. Why is it not universal and for everybody? Why is not everybody at school? Again, if it's about affordability, it's inevitable that blacks, our people, will be the ones who are not going to school and having access to healthcare. Current leadership. Last election was won by the ANC with 58% of the vote in May 2019. And Cyril Ramaphosa took over the presidency last year when they threw out Zuma. It was basically a coup d'etat. They basically had an internal coup and chucked out Zuma because he was becoming so embarrassing to the ANC. But it was a low turnout, only 46% turnout, because people are a bit disillusioned with the situation, but they can't see an alternative. The Africanists are not well enough organized, like the PAC, Azapo, and those other forces, to become a genuine force in South Africa. So the people feel they don't know who else to vote for. They're not going to vote for the whites. They're going to vote for an African party, and they only see the ANC. So even though it was a low turnout, they still won the majority of the vote. So voters very disappointed with the economic stagnation and the corruption under Zuma. But removing Zuma, is that just moving the deck chairs on the Titanic? The fundamental problem is the system and the political policies. Removing one person and putting somebody else makes no difference. What happened when David Cameron was removed from office, or he resigned, and I've forgotten her name already. Couldn't have been very strong on me. Theresa May came to power. What difference did it make? No difference whatsoever. And what was the difference when Theresa May lost power and Boris Johnson came to power? It made no difference whatsoever. So moving the deck chairs on the Titanic doesn't stop the Titanic from going down. So changing the leader, but without changing the policies, I don't see what difference it makes. So let's have a look at the economy before COVID-19, because all economies have been hit. This is what I'll show you the source in a minute. This is a source that's seen as a quite objective source of countries. They need to improve governance in state-owned enterprises because there's a large liability. I'm assuming liabilities means debts. It's debts to the government. So there's some issues there. Power shortages. Why on earth, after 26 years of government, with all the wealth of South Africa, we still have power shortages in South Africa? Why? Why is there high unemployment? We've already said 30% of Africans are unemployed in South Africa. This is 30% of the adult population. The GDP contracted by 3.2%. Remember, this is before the COVID. Yeah, the first quarter was before COVID hit. So you can't blame COVID for the contraction in the economy. So the economy is going down in South Africa. So what policies are they doing? It's not working. The largest decline since the global crisis in 2008. So after 11 years since the global crisis, the South African economy is in serious crisis. And here's GDP. Look at GDP from 2016 to now. It's hardly moved. 0.4, 1.4, 0.8, 0.6, 1.6. That's no growth. That's virtually no growth. And when you see Ghana, and I do Rwanda later, and these other places, the growth in Ethiopia is going up 7, 8%, 10% a year. Rwanda, same. Ghana, similar. And then we see South Africa, it's not really, there's no growth. So therefore, if there's no growth, the government's income is not really growing any significantly. So it's very difficult, unless the government does something different to redistribute wealth, it's very difficult to make a financial impact. So what about Black empowerment? Well, I can't say much about it because I can't see the benefits of where it went to. This is what was supposed to happen. There's supposed to be Black population share of the economy. Now there's talk of giving more shares to Africans for the mines and so on and so on. But again, unless this is done in a very sensible way, it's not going to make much difference to the average person. What did shares do to the average person in Britain? BT shares, gas shares, all the privatization that happened in Britain. Some of you may be too young to remember. Go and look at the history books. All the shares that were done in England, what difference did it make to the average person to have shares? Peanuts. I remember my mum bought some shares. She bought £200 worth of shares. Now, when there's a £20 billion share offer, £200 is a drop in the ocean. It's like putting a thimble of water in the sea. Makes no difference whatsoever. It's nothing. If my mum made 100% benefit from her shares, she would have gone from £200 to £400. Not going to change her life. But if I had £1 million worth of shares or £20 million of shares and it doubled, now I've got £40 million of shares. Can you see the difference? So shares, when they're little shares, it's just meaningless. It doesn't mean anything to the average population. We don't need shares in businesses. We need the profits from the businesses to be spent on the people. Giving everybody a little slice of the cake is nothing. Giving the government a big slice so they can give the people is something. So it's very important we understand this. This is the different types of way of looking at leadership. So investment in mining has dried up, partly because of the strikes and that, But also, there's a little bit of worry from Western leaders. They're not too sure about Ramaphosa if he's going to do things, but most of them think he's still pro-Western. So I don't know what they're saying about. There's a bit of concern about Western investment. So a bit more about post-COVID. Let's have a look. Basically, it's in recession. They think they're forecasting a 6.7% contraction of GDP in South Africa. A massive problem. I don't know how they're going to get poverty. If you think about the amount of jobs, America lost 33 million jobs in the last few months. Britain is heading for a massive loss of jobs as well. But because they have the furlough scheme in Britain, we're not going to see the impact of it until August, September, October, when the furlough starts to end. In this country, we have 4 to 5 million people on furlough. Furlough basically means the government are paying their salary. When the government stops paying that salary towards September, October, if those businesses are not thriving, they're all unemployed. This is the neoliberal policies we see in countries like this. Inflation is also quite high as well, because inflation, if you know anything about inflation, 4-5% inflation is still quite high. Yeah, so that means prices are going up and the economy is going down, means it's making it less affordable for the average person to afford to buy things. We're not far from the end now. We'll have time for some questions as well. The country's sovereign debt rating has been downgraded. The introduction of minimum wage has at least helped. But again, if you haven't got a job, minimum wage doesn't mean anything. That's the source, Garda World. Now let's look at crime. Crime, a reason why I mentioned crime is because we looked at the social economic situation of the country, but I have to mention crime, which I wouldn't normally necessarily mention in most African countries, because most African countries, crime is not a major problem. Not, well, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of them, it's not a major issue. What's a major issue is poverty, not crime. In South Africa, it's a massive issue. Crime is a dominant security issue in South Africa. It's the biggest, the highest murder rate in the world. Now, this is not our fault. This is the fault of apartheid, because under apartheid, it became a very violent nation. And if you have poverty, violence, and protest, and you put all that together, you're going to have a lot of violence. Who carjacks? In a country where people are not poor, you don't have carjackings. You only have carjackings in very poor countries like Mexico or countries where there's a big disparity between rich and poor. What we see in places like Jamaica, in countries where there's big differences between rich and poor, we see the most violent. Israel, Jamaica, South Africa are 3 of the most violent countries in the world. But look at the difference between the rich and poor in Israel, between the Palestinians and the so-called Israelis, Jamaica, and places like South Africa. And where there's high levels of inequality, like in America as well, there's high levels of crime, especially violent crime as well. Look at the statistics, 58 killings a day. Now, let me just quickly get my calculator out because I want to work out what that is. So 58 times 365 is 21,000 murders a year in South Africa. Now, Britain has a similar population to South Africa, and there's only about 400 murders in Britain a year. Compare 400 murders to, which is about 1 murder a day in Britain on average, 1 murder a day in Britain on average, compared to 58 murders a day in South Africa. If you had 58 murders a day in England, you'd have the army on the street, because it's a crisis of massive proportions. And this is what makes South Africa unsafe. I wanted to go and live in South Africa until I understood all this and realized, why am I going to take my family and go and live there? I'm leaving England to go and live in a country that's dominated by Europeans in Africa, where we've got 30% unemployment and we've got 58 murders a day, carjackings, and I'm going to have a house with electrical fence and all kind of security. I don't want to live like that. It's a crazy situation. So, but this number is lower than the peak. So it was even worse. 20 years ago, it was even worse than it is now. 58 murders a day. How many was it then? The most violent incidents are highly localized in townships. Who lives in the townships? Is it a simple question? I think you know the answer. When we say most violent incidents, so most of those murders, yes, you guessed it, white people don't live in townships. It's mostly us killing our own people. And do not use the term black on black violence, because most people in the world, anywhere in the world, are murdered by somebody you know. So all murders are by the same, most murders are by the same ethnic group. So black on black violence is a nonsense language, because most people in a white country are killed by a white person. Most people in Glasgow are killed by a Glaswegian. right? So it's nonsense, black on black violence. Break-ins and armories, because there was a break-in in can you believe this? Criminals broke into armories, the government armories, and stole automatic weapons. So there's fears of more crime. And look at this, carjacking remains a frequent despite a small decrease in 2019. Carjackings, armed carjackings. It's crazy. Right, let's look at the political outlook then. The economic freedom fighters have joined the pressure groups to call for constitutional and legislative changes. And it might, they seem to be saying it might materialize. I'm not sure how this is going to happen, but I'm interested to see how is it going to happen in this parliament. I call it the sixth parliament because it's the sixth election. There's still lots of protests and lots of violence. It's only going to get worse after COVID, because once the streets are opened up and people are having even more, because you imagine if there's 30% unemployment now, how much unemployment will there be after COVID-19? We're going to see more violence in South Africa, unfortunately, unless the government has something they're going to do to help the situation. So that's why I was saying that Africanist parties need to unite, come together as one, and take on the ANC. Otherwise, I can't see what's going to change unless the ANC reforms itself. So here's my conclusions. Leadership in South Africa has been poor. Mandela, now, I didn't go into much detail of some of this because we'd be here all night. But Mandela, let's look at Mandela's record. Most of the people I ask who love Mandela, I always say to them, symbolically, very significant. Dedicated his life, absolutely honor the man. Most of us would not be prepared to go for 27 years in prison for our people. Most of us wouldn't. So we have to admire him for giving his life to his people. He gave his life to the people. I accept that and I respect that. But he wasn't the only one. Let's just remember that. It wasn't just him. There was many others. And some of those people in prison, he left them in there. Now, how could you be 27 years in prison, become the president, and leave some of your people in prison? That's madness. But that story is not being told. Why did Mandela allow all the sanctions to be lifted before any of the sports changed? They were still all white when he lifted the ban. The famous picture of South Africa winning the World Cup when Mandela came and celebrated with them with an all white team. What's that about? We couldn't understand it. Now, I understood the nationhood and trying to build a country. I understand that. But where was the commitment to redistribute the wealth? And guess what? When the criticism of Zuma with the complaint about him being corrupt was when there was an arms deal, when Zuma was leading the arms deal, and you ask yourself, why did South Africa under Mandela spend billions of pounds on aircrafts and military arms? Who is going to invade South Africa? Nobody. Why did they spend billions on those arms? I'll tell you why. Because it was a thank you to the Europe, thank you to the West. Because you're only buying it from the West. Why didn't he spend those billions on redistributing wealth to the people? Why does South Africa need modern aircrafts, military aircrafts, to do what with? So so that corrupt deal was done when Mandela was the president. So even though Mandela was never considered to be corrupt, but Zuma was in the government when that corruption scandal happened. And all the time Zuma was in power, they kept going on about this corruption, but it was during Mandela's time. So all I'm saying is, what did Mandela achieve other than, obviously, helping end apartheid? But it wasn't done by him. I showed you the history. He was just one player within the whole situation. And we know where he was for 27 years. He was in prison. So it was somebody else doing it. So we know that it wasn't just one individual. And Mbeki, classically educated in the West. There was a famous story that was told to me privately. But it became a little bit, well, I say a famous story in parts of South Africa and amongst the Africanists, that Thabo Mbeki's father slapped him round the face when he found out what Mbeki had done and what they had negotiated in South Africa. Look up the story, look up the history. Thabo Mbeki's father was a militant in the ANC and thought that Mbeki and them had sold us out. Look up the history. But give Mbeki his dues to a little bit. He was very concerned with Africa, and he supported Zimbabwe and all the Western pressure to remove Mugabe and have a coup in Zimbabwe. Mbeki resisted all of that. Okay? So I put Mandela supported Zimbabwe. Of course, it was Mbeki. My apologies here. And then the last one, was Zuma, which was an embarrassment because they thought he could connect with the base. And the masses he just lacked competence, basically. It was an embarrassment, and they had to get rid of him. But again, are they moving the deck chairs on the Titanic? Because now we have Ramaphosa, who I told you was the leading negotiator for the 1994 election. Little evidence of change, although he claims he's going to take the land, but we're still waiting to see what is he going to do. And he's now the chair of the African Union. So he has every reason to be Pan-Africanist in his behavior. Well, the story's out on that one. So you can conclude for yourself, what is Ramaphosa going to be as a leader? So I believe the leadership of South Africa, as I said, has predominantly been poor. Given the resources that they have at their disposal, I don't think they've used them well enough. And I think we have a serious problem in South Africa with massive social problems. And I can't see how it's going to end anytime soon. Okay? Poverty, this is the why I say it's poor. Poverty amongst Africans is still a major issue. There's still mass unemployment, higher levels of murder in the world, not safe for women or girls, land has not been returned to Africans, little show of Pan-African leadership, whites still control most of the economy, corruption is still a huge issue, the gap between the rich and the poor remains enormous, which is still basically between the white and the blacks, or apart from the privileged blacks. The economy has not grown in years, so there's little hope that it's going anywhere. And the neoliberalism remains the dominant ideology. So that's my conclusion.